Welcome to Danceplaying, everyone. I'm Edward, and as always, with me is the brilliant Lily.
Thanks for having me back.
All right, Lily, buckle up, because we were taking a deep dive into the intertwined histories of Canada and the USA. Two nations we often think of as, similar, but trust me, you'll be surprised by the distinct paths they've taken. We've got this incredible historical analysis comparing their evolution from those early settlements all the way to their modern identities.
Yeah, what's fascinating is how these two neighbors sharing a long border and intertwined history ended up with such distinct identities. We'll uncover some surprising twists and turns along the way.
Exactly. And we'll tackle some intriguing questions like, why did Canada choose to stick with Britain when the U.S. fought for independence? How did the fur trade shape Canada differently than, say, tobacco shaped the early U.S.? And of course, we have to address the elephant in the room. Why is Canada still a monarchy in the 21st century?
All great questions, and I think you'll be particularly surprised by Canada's role in the American Revolution. It's not quite what most people learn in history class.
Ooh, that's a good tease. Okay, so let's rewind all the way back to the beginning. Before European explorers arrived, both Canada and the U.S. were already home to incredibly diverse indigenous populations. We're talking about nations with rich cultures, political systems, and trade networks that thrived for centuries. It's crucial to remember that the history we often learn is just a small part of a much larger story.
Absolutely. And what's even more fascinating is that there's evidence of European contact even before those famous explorers like Columbus arrived. You might be surprised to know that Norse explorers Vikings essentially reached North America centuries before Columbus.
Wait, seriously, before Columbus? I thought he was, the guy who discovered America.
History is full of surprises. Leif Erikson and his crew landed in present-day Newfoundland, a place they called Vinland, around the year 1000. Imagine that Vikings in North America centuries before Columbus.
Wow, so those Viking tales were actually true. That changes my whole perspective on early exploration. But if they were there first, why didn't they stick around?
That's a great question, and the reasons for the short-lived Norse settlements in Vinland are still debated by historians. But it does highlight that the history of European contact in North America is more complex than we often realize.
Okay, so let's fast forward a few centuries to the more familiar story of European colonization. England and France enter the scene, both eager to stake their claims in this new world, but they went about it in very different ways.
Yeah, their motivations and strategies were key to understanding how these colonies developed. The French, with their base in New France, what we now call Canada, were primarily driven by the lucrative fur trade.
Right. They formed strong alliances with indigenous peoples, particularly the Huron-Wendat, to navigate the vast territories and secure those valuable furs. They depended on those relationships for their economic success.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about economics. The French also had a strong religious presence through Catholic missionaries, which significantly shaped the social and political landscape of New France. They aimed to convert indigenous populations and establish a strong Catholic presence in the colony.
Meanwhile, down south, you had the 13 British colonies focused on rapid expansion and diverse economies. They were driven by agriculture trade, and unfortunately, those infamous plantation systems in the south, which relied on enslaved labor. They attracted waves of immigrants with the promise of land and opportunity, leading to rapid population growth.
That difference in population growth is crucial. The British colonies were booming, while New France remained comparatively sparsely populated. This would have long-term consequences for the development of both regions.
So we've got this interesting contrast, the fur-trading French with their indigenous allies versus the land-hungry British colonists with their growing population. It's like a classic showdown in the making.
And a showdown it became. Remember those European power struggles we talked about? Well, they didn't stay confined to Europe. Britain and France's rivalry spilled over into North America, leading to a series of wars fought on colonial soil.
Yeah, it seems like they were constantly at war. King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War. It's a lot to keep track of.
It is. But it was the French and Indian War, known globally as the 7 Years' War, that truly changed the game. This war ended in 1763 with a decisive British victory and the Treaty of Paris, which redrew the map of North America.
Treaty of Paris, a major turning point. This is where France loses most of its North American territory.
Exactly. France ceded control of Canada to Britain. This was a seismic shift, especially for the French Canadians who suddenly found themselves under the rule of their former enemy.
That must have been a shock. So how did the French Canadians react to this sudden change in power?
Well, the British were shrewd. They knew they needed to accommodate the French-speaking Catholic population if they wanted to maintain stability in their newly acquired territory. So they passed the Quebec Act in 1774, which allowed French Canadians to keep their civil law religious practices and even their system of land tenure.
That was a smart move by the British. It probably prevented a lot of potential unrest and resistance.
Yeah.
But speaking of unrest, this is where things get really interesting with the American Revolution brewing down south.
This is where Canada's story takes a surprising turn, especially for those who haven't delved deeper into this period.
Okay, lay it on us. What was Canada's role in the American Revolution?
Well, believe it or not, the American revolutionaries actually tried to invade Quebec in 1775.
Wait, they wanted to make Canada part of the rebellion. Why would they think that would work?
They assumed the French Canadians would sympathize with their cause, having just experienced British rule themselves. They figured they'd be eager to join the fight for independence.
But it backfired, right?
Big time. The French Canadians, for various reasons, weren't interested in joining the American cause. The Quebec Act had actually given them certain freedoms and protections, and some even saw advantages in remaining under British rule. So the invasion failed, and Quebec remained loyal to the crown.
Wow, if the Americans had succeeded there, the map of North America could look very different today. It's amazing how one event can have such a ripple effect. So the U.S. declares independence and forges its own path, while Canada solidifies its ties to Britain. But how did that impact the demographics of both countries?
Well, after the American Revolution, thousands of American colonists who remained loyal to Britain, known as Loyalists, faced persecution in the newly formed United States. They decided to flee north to British Canada, seeking refuge and a new life.
So you have this wave of English speakers coming into Canada, settling in places like Ontario and the Maritimes, adding to the already complex cultural mix.
Exactly. This influx of loyalists had a profound impact on Canada's future, shaping its demographics, culture, and political landscape. It's another example of how these two nations are deeply intertwined.
It's incredible how events in one country can have such lasting effects on its neighbor.
Yeah.
So we've got the U.S. striking out on its own and Canada solidifying its connection to Britain. But both nations are still figuring out their governance and place in the world. Where do we go from here?
That's where we'll pick up in part 2 of this deep dive. You won't want to miss the next chapter in this historical saga.
Sounds good. See you then.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the histories of Canada and the USA. Last time we left off with both countries on the verge of some major transformations in the mid-19th century.
You're right about that. It's a fascinating period because you've got these parallel events happening.
Yeah.
The U.S. grappling with the deep divisions that will erupt into the Civil War and Canada on the path towards unification. It really highlights their contrasting approaches to nation building.
Yeah, it's a stark contrast that helps us understand their distinct identities.
Mm-hmm.
On one hand, you have the U.S. facing a tumultuous internal conflict over issues like slavery, states' rights, and economic disparities. This exposed the deep fault lines within American society.
It's almost hard to imagine the U.S. tearing itself apart like that. But what about Canada? They seem to be taking a very different approach to nation building, a more collaborative one.
Yeah.
What was driving that movement towards unification?
Well, there were several factors at play. One was a growing sense of vulnerability in the face of potential U.S. expansionism. The U.S. had just gone through this massive internal conflict, and some Canadians feared they might turn their attention northward.
So there was a sense of needing to strengthen their defenses to present a more unified front. That makes sense.
Exactly. And on top of that, the British colonies in North America were starting to see the economic and political benefits of uniting. Think about projects like building a transcontinental railway. Something of that scale would require a more cohesive approach.
It was about creating a stronger, more cohesive entity, not just for defense, but for economic progress as well.
Yeah.
So how did this movement towards unification actually take shape?
Well, it all culminated in the British North America Act of 1867. This act essentially created the Dominion of Canada, uniting the provinces of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and the province of Canada, which was then split into Ontario and Quebec.
Hold on. They united the provinces, but then immediately split one of them in half. That seems counterintuitive. Why did they do that?
It might seem strange at first, but the split was actually a way to address those distinct cultural and linguistic differences we talked about earlier. Remember, Canada has a strong French heritage, especially in Quebec. The split was designed to recognize the unique needs and identities of English-speaking Ontario and French-speaking Quebec.
Ah, I see. It was about finding a balance that would work for everyone, acknowledging the distinct cultures within Canada.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The idea was to create a system where both English and French Canadians felt represented and could thrive.
Sure.
So on July 1st, 1867, Canada officially became a self-governing dominion within the British Empire. They had their own parliament, their own prime minister, but they still recognized the British monarch as their head of state.
That's interesting. They were self-governing but still connected to Britain, so it wasn't a complete break from the British Empire like the U.S. Revolution, but more of a step towards greater autonomy.
You've hit the nail on the head. It was a gradual evolution towards independence, a stark contrast to the U.S.'s revolutionary break from Britain. And over the years, more provinces and territories joined the Confederation: Manitoba in 1870, British Columbia in 1871, Prince Edward Island in 1873, and later the vast Northwest Territories, which were eventually divided into several provinces and territories, including Saskatchewan and Alberta in 1905.
So while the U.S. was rebuilding after a devastating civil war, Canada was steadily growing and piecing together its own national identity province by province.
And it wasn't until 1949 that Newfoundland finally joined Canada, highlighting this gradual process of unification. But meanwhile, the U.S., fueled by industrial expansion and massive immigration, was rapidly becoming a global power. They purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867 and acquired overseas territories after the Spanish-American War in 1898.
It sounds like they were really asserting themselves on the world stage. But what about Canada during this time? They were still the dominion within the British Empire, weren't they?
Yes, but their autonomy continued to increase. The Statute of Westminster in 1931 was a major milestone. It granted Canada greater legislative independence from Britain, essentially recognizing them as an equal partner within the Commonwealth. And finally, in 1982, Canada achieved full constitutional sovereignty with the patriation of their constitution.
So it was a long and winding road to complete independence for Canada, a very different path than the U.S. But how did these different historical trajectories shape the identities and values of these two countries?
That's a key question. Their colonial legacies played a huge role. The U.S. was predominantly shaped by English, then British culture and law. Of course, there were other influences, Dutch in New York, Spanish in Florida and the Southwest, but British influence remained dominant.
Canada, on the other hand, had this unique blend of French and English influences, particularly with the strong French presence in Quebec.
Exactly. And that's why Canada has official bilingualism recognizing both English and French as national languages. It's a fundamental part of their identity, a reflection of their history and cultural diversity.
That cultural duality also extends to their political systems and cultures, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. The U.S., with its revolutionary origins, emphasizes individualism, a strong central government, and a written constitution that enshrines those freedoms in the Bill of Rights. It's all about those core American values of liberty and self-reliance forged during their struggle for independence.
Right. Their president is both head of state and head of government, directly elected by the people. It's a system designed to balance power and prevent tyranny, reflecting their revolutionary past. Canada, on the other hand, opted for a parliamentary democracy under a constitutional monarchy. They have a prime minister as head of government accountable to the elected parliament, while the British monarch, represented by the governor-general, serves as head of state. It's a system that emphasizes collaboration and consensus building.
It's a fascinating contrast, isn't it? Their histories are reflected in their political structures. And wouldn't you say those differing values also play out in their political cultures?
Definitely. The U.S., with its emphasis on individualism, often sees more dramatic swings between political parties and ideologies. It's a more adversarial system, with each side vying for power.
While in Canada, you tend to see more cooperation and coalition building. They're less about those dramatic shifts and more about finding common ground. It's a reflection of their history of compromise and gradual change.
Of course, this isn't to say one system is inherently better than the other. They both have their strengths and weaknesses, and they're both constantly evolving and adapting to new challenges.
Exactly. And speaking of challenges, how about we delve into their westward expansion and relationships with Indigenous peoples? It's another area where we see interesting parallels and divergences.
Great idea. Both countries engaged in significant westward expansion during the 19th century, but their approaches differed in some key ways.
In the U.S., westward expansion was often characterized by conflict and displacement of Indigenous nations. It's a tragic chapter in their history, marked by events like the Trail of Tears, where Native American tribes were forcibly relocated, resulting in immense suffering and loss of life.
It's a dark period that continues to have repercussions today.
Absolutely. Canada's westward expansion also involved treaties and conflicts with Indigenous peoples, but their approach was shaped by different historical and legal frameworks.
For example, Canada established the Indian Act in 1876, which attempted to create a system for governing relations with Indigenous communities. While flawed and controversial, It reflects a different approach than the outright displacement that often occurred in the U.S.
You're right, it was a different approach, but it's important to note that Canada's history with Indigenous peoples is also marked by broken promises and systemic inequalities. It's a complex and challenging legacy that both countries continue to grapple with today.
It's a reminder that despite their differences, both countries share a common history of colonialism and its lasting impact on Indigenous communities.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, haven't we?
We have. It's been quite a journey through history. But before we wrap up this part, how about we recap some of those key dates that illustrate the diverging paths of Canada and the USA?
I think that would be helpful. It's always good to have a clear timeline in mind when exploring such a complex history.
Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. We started with those Norse explorers reaching Newfoundland around 1000 CE. It's a little-known fact that often gets overlooked in the grand narrative of North American history.
Then we have John Cabot's voyage in 1497, staking an English claim in Atlantic Canada. And just a few decades later, in the 1530s, Jacques Cartier explores the St. Lawrence River, laying the groundwork for what will become New France.
And then boom, 1607 marks the founding of Jamestown, the first permanent English colony in what will become the United States. Just a year later, in 1608, Quebec City is founded, establishing the heart of New France.
Those early settlements really set the stage for the distinct colonial developments that followed.
Then in 1763, the Treaty of Paris ends the Seven Years' War, a major turning point, as Britain gains control of New France, forever altering the course of Canadian history.
And of course, we can't forget the American Revolution from 1775 to 1783. This is where the U.S. declares its independence from Britain, while Canada chooses to remain within the British Empire.
The Treaty of Paris in 1783 formally recognizes U.S. independence, solidifying the separation of the 13 colonies from Britain.
And as the U.S. forms its new government in 1791, the Constitutional Act divides Quebec into Upper and Lower Canada, laying the foundation for the modern provinces of Ontario and Quebec.
Then in 1812, the U.S. attempts to invade Canada during the War of 1812, but fails, further solidifying their separate trajectories.
And internally, both nations experience growing pains. Canada faces the rebellions of 1837 to 1838, pushing for a responsible government.
And in 1861, the American Civil War erupts, a defining moment in their history, as they grapple with issues of slavery and national unity.
And almost simultaneously in 1867, the British North America Act is passed, creating the Dominion of Canada, marking a different path towards nationhood.
It's fascinating to see these two very different paths unfolding side by side. The U.S. fighting to preserve its union, while Canada is forging a new one through collaboration and compromise.
It's a reminder that history is full of unexpected turns and contrasting approaches to similar challenges. But where does their journey lead them next?
That's where we'll pick up in part 3 of our deep dive. We'll explore how these historical differences continue to shape Canada and the U.S. today, even as they remain close allies and neighbors.
Stay tuned for the final chapter of our historical exploration. You won't want to miss it.
Welcome back to Dansplain for the final part of our deep dive into the intertwined histories of Canada and the USA. We've traced their journeys from those early settlements through wars and rebellions to their distinct paths towards nationhood. Now let's explore how these historical differences continue to shape them today.
Yeah, it's remarkable how those early choices and defining moments have echoed through the years, influencing their political systems, cultures, and even their relationships with each other.
Right. Last time we talked about how Canada's path toward independence was more of a gradual evolution within the British Empire, unlike the U.S.'s dramatic break. But they eventually reached full constitutional sovereignty in 1982 with the patriation of their constitution.
And that difference in approach is a key theme we see throughout their histories. The U.S., born out of revolution, embraced individual liberty and forged its own path, while Canada chose a more collaborative evolutionary approach, working within existing structures to achieve its goals.
So we've got these two distinct narratives playing out. The U.S., a nation built on a foundation of individual rights and a strong central government. And Canada, a nation that values compromise, gradualism, and a more collective approach. How do those contrasting approaches play out in their political systems today?
Well, the U.S., with its emphasis on individual liberty, has that iconic Bill of Rights enshrined in its Constitution. It's a powerful symbol of those core American values forged during their fight for independence.
And they have a president who serves as both head of state and head of government, directly elected by the people. It's a system designed to balance power and prevent tyranny, reflecting those concerns that emerged during the Revolution.
Exactly. Canada, on the other hand, chose a parliamentary democracy under a constitutional monarchy. They have a prime minister as head of government responsible to the elected parliament, and the British monarch, represented by the Governor-General, serves as head of state.
So it's a more nuanced system, wouldn't you say? One that emphasizes collaboration and consensus building.
Precisely. It's a system where different voices and perspectives can be heard, and decisions are often made through negotiation and compromise. It's a very different approach than the winner-take-all system you often see in the U.S.
And those differing values seem to be reflected in their political cultures, too. The U.S., with its focus on individualism, often sees those dramatic swings between political parties and ideologies. It can feel very adversarial at times.
While in Canada, you see more cooperation and coalition building, they're less about those dramatic shifts and more about finding common ground and working together. It's a reflection of their history of gradualism and compromise.
Of course, no political system is perfect. They both have their strengths and weaknesses, and they're constantly evolving to meet new challenges. But it's fascinating how those historical differences continue to shape their approaches to governance.
It's a reminder that history isn't just something that happened in the past. It shapes who we are today, how we see the world, and how we interact with each other.
Right. And speaking of interactions, how about we touch on their relationship with each other? They share the longest undefended border in the world, but they also have this complex history of competition and cooperation.
It's a unique dynamic, isn't it? They're neighbors, allies, trading partners, and at times rivals. They've fought wars against each other, but they've also stood shoulder to shoulder in times of crisis.
It's like that sibling rivalry where you bicker and compete, but deep down you have each other's backs.
That's a great analogy. And despite their differences, they share many values and interests. They're both democracies committed to individual liberty and the rule of law. They have strong economic ties and collaborate on issues like security and environmental protection.
So it's a complex relationship full of contradictions, but ultimately they've managed to find a way to coexist and thrive as neighbors.
And wouldn't you say that their shared history, despite its conflicts and complexities, has ultimately contributed to a deeper understanding and appreciation of their differences?
Definitely. It's through understanding their past, the choices they made, the challenges they faced, that we can truly appreciate the distinct identities they've forged.
And as we move forward, it's crucial to keep that historical perspective in mind as we navigate the challenges of the 21st century.
Well, folks, there you have it. We've journeyed through the fascinating and surprisingly interconnected histories of Canada and the USA. We've seen how their distinct paths to nationhood, their contrasting values and approaches, and their unique relationship have shaped them into the nations they are today.
It's been a pleasure exploring these historical nuances with you. Be sure to visit our website, www.dansplain.xyz.
We'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep dansplaining the world around you.